For centuries, Zen Buddhism has offered a different way of meeting life. Not through complexity or struggle, but through simplicity, through learning to be present with what actually is, rather than fighting for what we wish would be. Tonight, we'll go on a journey that explores these ancient teachings, not as lessons to memorize or techniques to master, but as stories to rest with. Before we begin, feel free to share what time it is and where you're listening from. Zen teaches that what we're looking for is already here. The calm we seek isn't hidden somewhere in the future, waiting for the right conditions. It's present now, beneath the surface of your thoughts, beneath your worries about tomorrow and memories of today. These stories are just invitations to notice what was here all along. Peace doesn't require perfection. Rest doesn't demand that everything be solved first. There's nothing you need to prepare, nothing you need to understand before we begin. Just relax. Take a slow, deep breath, and let's begin our journey together. Brother Masato had been at the mountain monastery for 8 months, and a question lived with him constantly. What does it mean to truly listen? It wasn't an idle curiosity. The question woke him before dawn and followed him through his daily tasks. It sat with him during meditation and walked beside him on the forest paths. His teacher, Master Koyo, was a woman of 70 years who moved with the unhurried grace of someone who had long ago stopped fighting with time. She spoke rarely, and when she did, her words were simple. She smiled often, a smile that seemed to come from some deep well of understanding that Masato could not access. When Masato brought his question to her, she would listen with her whole attention. Her eyes would meet his, kind and clear. Then she would nod slowly, as if acknowledging something important. But she never answered. She would simply return to whatever task occupied her hands, sweeping the courtyard with long, even strokes, tending the vegetable garden, her fingers gentle with the young plants, preparing tea with a focus that made even that simple act seem sacred. Her silence didn't answer his question. It only made the question grow larger, more pressing. Masato watched the other monks, trying to understand what they seemed to grasp that eluded him. Some of them had been at the monastery for years. They moved through their days with a quality of presence that he envied. When they sat in meditation, their faces became still as mountain lakes. When they worked, they seemed fully absorbed in each task, no matter how ordinary. Masato tried to copy them. He tried to be present. He tried to listen. But his mind was always somewhere else, always searching, always asking its question. One morning in early autumn, the air carried the first hint of coolness after the long summer. The maple trees around the temple were just beginning to turn, touches of red appearing among the green. Master Koyo assigned Masato the task of clearing fallen leaves from around the temple's main entrance. He found the rake leaning against the wall where it was kept and carried it to the front steps. The leaves had begun to gather there, blown by the mountain winds. Red and gold, they made a thick carpet across the stone pathway. He began working slowly, the rake making soft scraping sounds as it moved through the leaves. His mind circled its familiar territory. What am I missing? The other monks seem to understand something I don't. Why can't I find what I'm looking for? Master Koyo's silence felt like a wall he couldn't climb. Each day he grew more frustrated, more convinced that he was failing at something essential. The rake struck something solid beneath the leaves. The sound was different, a dull thud instead of the scraping of wood on stone. Masato stopped and knelt down. He brushed away the layer of autumn color with his hands, revealing a smooth river stone about the size of his palm. It was gray and completely ordinary. No interesting markings caught the eye. No unusual shape distinguished it from countless other stones that dotted the temple grounds. It was just a stone, the kind you might skip across a pond without a second thought or use to mark a path without really seeing it. Yet Masato found himself picking it up. The stone was cool against his skin, pleasantly smooth. He could feel the subtle irregularities in its surface, places where water had worn it down over years, maybe decades, maybe longer. It had weight, substance. It fit comfortably in his hand. He sat down on the temple steps, still holding the stone. The morning sun was warm on his face. A breeze moved through the maple trees, and a few more leaves drifted down, spinning slowly as they fell. Somewhere nearby, a cricket was singing its late-season song. And then, remembering his question about listening, Masato decided to try something. It felt a bit foolish, even to him. Stones don't speak, after all. They don't have wisdom to share in words. But his teacher had once mentioned, almost in passing, that wisdom could be found in unexpected places. That, sometimes, the most profound teachings came from what seemed most ordinary. So he closed his eyes and tried to listen to the stone. At first there was only the sound of his own breathing, and behind that, the familiar chatter of his mind. This is pointless. You're wasting time when you should be finishing the raking. What are you even doing? Someone might see you sitting here talking to a rock. This isn't how you're supposed to practice. The thoughts came in waves, each one pulling at his attention. His mind wanted to analyze, to judge, to move on to the next thing. It wanted to be anywhere but here, holding this stone, trying to listen. But he kept sitting. Something stubborn in him refused to give up, even though he wasn't sure what he was trying to do. He kept holding the stone, feeling its coolness, its weight. He kept his eyes closed. He kept trying to listen, though he didn't know what that meant anymore. Minutes passed. The cricket kept singing. The breeze kept moving through the trees. Gradually, without him noticing exactly when it happened, something began to shift. Not dramatically. There was no sudden flash of insight. Just a gentle softening, like ice beginning to thaw at the edges. His mind's chatter didn't stop completely, but it became quieter, more distant, like voices in another room. And in that quieter space, he became aware of other things. The wind moving through the pine trees nearby, a sound he had heard every day, but never really listened to. The branches swayed and the needles rustled, creating a soft whisper that rose and fell. He heard birds calling to one another in the distance, their voices clear and bright in the morning air. One sang 3 notes, high and sweet. Another answered with a different pattern, lower and more complex. The faint murmur of monks chanting came from inside the hall. The morning service had begun. Their voices blended together like water over stones, individual words disappearing into a flow of sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. And still Masato listened, his attention widening. He heard the whisper of his own breath moving in and out, a sound so constant he usually forgot it was there. He felt the steady rhythm of his heart, the pulse of blood through his body. His thumb moved slightly against the stone surface, and he heard even that, the faint sound of skin on stone. Beneath all the individual sounds, there was something else. Not a sound exactly, but a presence. A kind of quiet hum that seemed to hold everything together. The simple fact of existence itself. Morning. Mountain. Breathing. Being. The stone remained in his hand. Cool. Smooth. Silent. Unchanging. It had no wisdom to offer in words. It made no promises. It simply was what it was, completely and without question. Masato exhaled slowly and opened his eyes. The world looked the same as before. The stone looked exactly as it had when he first picked it up. Grey, ordinary, unremarkable. The leaves still covered the pathway. The rake still leaned against his leg where he had set it down. Yet, something had changed. Not in the stone. Not in the world around him. In him. In how he was meeting the moment. He stood slowly, still holding the stone. His legs had stiffened a bit from sitting, and he stretched them carefully. Then he walked to where Master Koyo was sweeping the path that led to the garden. Her movements were rhythmic and peaceful, the broom making long, even strokes across the stones. Masato approached and bowed. He placed the stone on the ground before her, saying nothing. Words felt unnecessary now, somehow too small for what he wanted to express. The old woman stopped sweeping. She looked down at the stone for a long moment, her eyes soft. Then she looked at Masato, and something in her expression shifted. Recognition, perhaps, or acknowledgement. Her eyes were warm and knowing, carrying that quality of understanding he had noticed before, but never quite grasped. "You have listened well," she said quietly. Her voice was gentle, almost a whisper, but it carried clearly in the morning air. Masato bowed again, deeper this time. He realized he didn't need to ask his question anymore. The stone had answered it, not through words or explanations, but through the quality of silence it had invited him into. Through the simple act of being present with something completely ordinary until it revealed itself as extraordinary. That evening, after the day's work was complete and the temple had settled into its nighttime quiet, Masato placed the stone on the small shelf in his room. It sat there among his few possessions. His wooden bowl, his extra robe, a candle, and now this stone, which was just a stone but also something more. A reminder of a moment when his restless searching had stopped and something deeper had opened up. In the days that followed, the stone remained on his shelf. Masato would see it each morning when he woke and each evening before he slept. It never moved. It never changed. It was exactly what it had always been. Yet, each time he looked at it, he remembered that morning on the temple steps. The moment when he learned to listen with more than just his ears. When he discovered that what he had been searching for wasn't hidden somewhere else. It was right here, in the simple act of paying attention, in becoming quiet enough to hear what had been present all along. This story speaks to something at the heart of Zen Buddhism. We spend so much time looking for wisdom in complicated places. We read books, study teachings, ask questions of teachers and masters. We search for answers, for techniques, for some special knowledge that will unlock understanding. We think wisdom must be difficult, must require years of practice or special insight. But the stone teaches something else. It teaches that what we're looking for isn't hidden in complexity. It's present in the simplest things, if we can learn to be present with them. Masato's question about listening was a genuine question, coming from a real longing to understand. But notice that he didn't get an answer in words. Master Koyo could have explained what true listening means. She could have given him techniques or practices, steps to follow, concepts to grasp. Instead, she just kept being quiet. Kept doing simple tasks with complete attention. She was showing him rather than telling him, inviting him to discover through his own experience what couldn't be captured in explanation. The stone became Masato's teacher because he finally stopped trying so hard to understand and just sat with it. He gave it his full attention, not analyzing it or thinking about it or trying to figure out what it meant, just being present with this ordinary piece of the mountain. What he discovered was that listening isn't really about the ears at all. It's about a quality of attention that includes everything. When we truly listen, we're not just hearing sounds. We're opening ourselves to the whole present moment. The wind, the birds, the breathing, the heartbeat, the silence that holds all sounds. The simple fact of being alive and aware. This is what Zen Buddhism means by presence. Not thinking about the moment, not analyzing it or trying to understand it or figure out what to do with it. Just being here, fully, with whatever is happening. The stone couldn't teach this through words. It could only invite Masato into a different way of being, and he had to accept that invitation himself. What's interesting is that the stone itself didn't change. It was the same before and after. Gray, ordinary, smooth. Masato was the one who changed. He stopped searching for understanding somewhere else and discovered it right where he was. In the simple act of sitting still, holding something ordinary, paying attention without trying to get anywhere or become anything. This matters because we live so much of our lives the way Masato lived those first 8 months. Restless, searching, asking questions and waiting for answers. Thinking that peace or wisdom or understanding is somewhere other than here, sometime other than now. We're so busy looking for it that we miss the fact that it's already present, has always been present, is presenting itself in every moment we're too distracted to notice. A young courier named Kaito hurried through the marketplace, a sealed letter pressed against his chest. His hand held it tightly, as if the paper might somehow escape if he loosened his grip. The governor was waiting for this message, and Kaito had been entrusted with its delivery. The responsibility felt heavy, important. There was no time to waste. His feet moved quickly through the crowded square, dodging between merchants and shoppers, his eyes focused on the path ahead. The market was busy that morning, as it always was, when the weather was good and the farmers had brought their produce down from the surrounding hills. The square was filled with color and sound and movement. Vendors called out their prices in sing-song voices, each trying to be heard over the others. Fresh fish, just caught this morning. Persimmons, sweet and ripe. Rice, the best quality. Cartwheels rattled over the uneven stone pavement, and somewhere a dog was barking. The smell of roasted chestnuts mixed with incense smoke drifting from a nearby temple. A woman was selling flowers, their fragrance adding another layer to the market's complex scent. People moved in every direction, each absorbed in their own purpose. Shopping for the evening meal. Meeting friends. Conducting business. The market was its own small world, chaotic and alive. Kaito wove through it all, without really seeing any of it. His mind was entirely on his task. Get to the governor's residence. Don't be late. Don't lose the letter. His jaw was tight. His shoulders were hunched forward. His breathing was shallow and quick. A gust of wind spiraled through the narrow alley between two stalls, the kind of small whirlwind that sometimes appeared in open spaces on windy days. It lifted a white feather into the air, carrying it up and away from wherever it had fallen. Perhaps from one of the chickens being sold at the poultry stall. Perhaps from a pillow someone was carrying. The feather's origin didn't matter. What mattered was how it moved. It drifted across Kaito's path, turning slowly in the air, catching the morning light. It rose on the breeze, dipped slightly, then settled directly in front of his next step, resting on the stones as if it had been placed there deliberately. His foot paused mid-stride. He stood there, frozen for a moment, one foot in the air, the other planted. Watching this white feather rest on the grey stones of the marketplace. An old vendor arranging oranges at a nearby stall noticed the young man's sudden stillness. He chuckled quietly, a warm sound that held no mockery. "You won't catch it by chasing," he said, his voice carrying just far enough to reach Kaito's ears. Kaito looked up, pulled from his focused trance. The vendor was elderly, his face deeply lined from years in the Sunday. His hands moved with practiced ease as he arranged the oranges in a careful pyramid, each piece of fruit placed with attention. He seemed in no hurry at all, as if he had all the time in the world for this simple task. "I wasn't trying to catch it," Kaito said, though he wasn't entirely sure why he responded at all. "He should be moving. He should be on his way." The vendor just smiled, a knowing expression that suggested he had seen many young men rushing through the market over the years, all convinced their urgency was uniquely important. He continued arranging his fruit. Each orange turned until it caught the light just right. Kaito looked back down at the feather. Another breeze stirred through the marketplace, gentler this time, and the feather lifted again. It spiraled away, rising higher, moving between the awnings and banners that hung above the stalls. It tumbled and turned, completely unconcerned with direction or purpose. Not trying to go anywhere in particular. Just moving with whatever wind found it, trusting each current to carry it where it would. Kaito watched it drift upward and away. His hand was still pressed against his chest, holding the letter. He became aware, suddenly, of how tightly he was gripping it. How fast his heart was beating beneath his palm. How his whole body felt clenched with urgency, every muscle tight with the need to hurry. The feather disappeared over a rooftop, and still Kaito stood there. He took a breath, a real breath, deeper than the shallow gasps he'd been taking as he rushed through the square. The smell of roasted chestnuts reached him again. This time, he actually noticed it. Warm and sweet, with a hint of smoke. His stomach responded, reminding him he'd left the house without eating. Someone was playing a flute somewhere beyond the square. The notes floated through the air, gentle and unhurried. A simple melody, probably a street musician hoping for a few coins. The music wove between the vendors' calls and the cart wheels and the conversations, adding something soft to the market's busy sounds. The vendor was still arranging his oranges, and Kaito found himself watching. The old man's movements were slow and deliberate. Each piece of fruit was picked up, examined, then placed with care. The morning sun lit up the oranges, making them glow like small lanterns. The pyramid was growing, each level carefully constructed to support the next. Kaito realized he had passed this stall many times. Dozens of times. Maybe hundreds in the months he'd been working as a courier. But he'd never really seen it. Never noticed the care the vendor took with his display. Never watched how the morning light transformed ordinary fruit into something beautiful. He loosened his grip on the letter. His shoulders dropped slightly, releasing tension he hadn't known he was carrying. His breathing slowed and deepened. The letter still needed to be delivered. That hadn't changed. The governor was still waiting. The message was still important. But Kaito found himself wondering if it truly had to be this very second. If perhaps the message would arrive exactly when it needed to, whether he ran there in a panic or walked with some awareness of the world around him. Whether arriving 2 minutes later would actually matter, or if his urgency was just a habit, a way of moving through the world that he'd never questioned. He stood still for another breath, then another. The flute continued its melody, notes rising and falling like the feather had risen and fallen. The vendor placed another orange on his pyramid, adjusting it slightly until it sat just right. People continued moving through the market. Some hurried like Kaito had been, others taking their time, examining vegetables, greeting friends, living their morning at their own pace. Kaito began walking again. Not as fast as before. Not with that tight, driven intensity. His hand still held the letter to his chest, but more gently now, without that desperate grip. He looked around as he walked, actually seeing the market for the first time in a long while. An old woman was selling flowers, each bloom arranged in simple bundles tied with grass. White chrysanthemums, yellow daisies, purple asters. She sat behind her display with a peaceful expression, not calling out like the other vendors, just letting the flowers speak for themselves. A child was laughing at something his mother said, the sound bright and free. The mother smiled down at him, in no rush to move along, content to share this moment of joy with her son. Kaito noticed the way the sunlight came through the fabric awnings, painting everything in soft, warm colors. Red and gold and orange, like autumn itself, had been caught in cloth and hung above the market square. The governor's residence was only 2 streets away. Kaito would arrive in a few minutes instead of 1. The message would be delivered. His duty would be fulfilled. But something in how he moved through the world had shifted, all because a feather had fallen in his path and he had paused just for a moment to watch it fly away. This story shows us something simple but easy to forget. We move through our days with such focused urgency. We have places to go, tasks to complete, people waiting for us. This feels important, and often it is. Responsibilities are real. Duties matter. But in our rush toward the next thing, we miss the texture of living itself. We miss the actual experience of being alive. Kaito was doing what felt necessary. Delivering a message quickly. Being responsible. Taking his work seriously. Nothing wrong with any of that. These are good qualities. But notice what was happening in his body, in his mind. His whole being was clenched. His awareness had narrowed to a single point. Get there. Don't waste time. Hurry. Everything else had disappeared. The feather interrupted this momentum. Not dramatically. Not with force or demand. Just gently, with its simple presence. A small white thing drifting on the wind, completely unbothered by urgency or purpose. It had no message to deliver, no deadline to meet, no one waiting for it. It simply moved with whatever moved it, rising and falling with complete trust in the wind's direction. Something about watching it helped Kaito remember that there's another way to be in the world. He could still deliver his message, still be responsible, still fulfill his duty, and arrive at the governor's residence. But he didn't have to turn himself into a tightly wound spring to do it. He didn't have to shut out everything except his goal. This is what Zen Buddhism calls getting lost in doing. We become so identified with our tasks and purposes that we forget we're also alive in this moment. We forget there's a whole world happening around us. Roasted chestnuts and flute music and morning sunlight. Small moments of beauty and presence that exist whether we notice them or not. Life happening right now, right here, while we rush past it towards some future moment when we think we'll finally have time to pay attention. The old vendor with his oranges was showing a different way. He was working too. Arranging fruit to sell, trying to attract customers, earning his living. But he wasn't at war with the moment. He placed each orange with care, as if this simple task deserved his full attention. He had time to notice a young man pausing to watch a feather. He could smile and offer a gentle observation. His work and his presence weren't separate things. He was fully there, doing what needed doing, but also being alive while doing it. The rain had been falling since dawn, turning the forest path into mud and standing water. 2 monks walked in silence, their robes growing heavy with moisture, their sandals making wet sounds with each step. Brother Kenji was young, barely 20, with only 2 years at the monastery. Brother Taizen had been walking these mountain paths for nearly 4 decades. The abbot had sent them together to deliver medicine to a village on the other side of the mountain. As they rounded a curve where the path dipped toward a stream, they saw a young woman standing at the water's edge. She wore fine silk robes, her hair arranged with carved wooden pins. She stared at the swollen stream with clear worry on her face. The water rushed brown and angry, carrying broken branches from higher up the mountain. What was normally a gentle brook had become a torrent that would reach past her knees. She turned as she heard their footsteps and bowed. "Honored monks," she said, "I was visiting my grandmother when the rain started. Now I cannot cross. My clothes will be ruined and I am expected home before nightfall. Would one of you be willing to help me?" Kenji stiffened immediately. His hand moved to the prayer beads at his waist. "Certainly not," he said, his voice tight. "Our vows forbid physical contact with women. Surely you know this." The young woman's face fell. She looked back at the rushing water, then at the darkening sky. Taizen said nothing. He simply walked forward, adjusted his robe, and bent slightly. "Climb onto my back," he said calmly. The woman hesitated, looking between the 2 monks. Kenji had turned away, his face rigid. But Taizen waited patiently, and finally she accepted. The older monk carried her across the stream with steady, careful steps. The water pulled at his robes, and the current tried to push him sideways, but his footing remained sure. When they reached the other side, he set her down gently on the dry path. She bowed deeply, her hands pressed together. "Thank you, honored teacher. You have shown great kindness." Taizen returned her bow and watched as she hurried up the path toward the village, her silk robes untouched by the muddy water. Kenji crossed the stream alone, jumping from rock to rock with barely hidden anger. When he reached the other side, he would not look at his companion. They walked on through the forest. The rain began to ease, and patches of pale sky appeared between the clouds. Neither monk spoke. An hour passed. Then another. The path climbed steadily upward, winding between ancient cedars whose bark was thick with moss. Normally, Kenji enjoyed this part of the journey. Today, he could see nothing but his own churning thoughts. Finally, as they stopped to rest near a small shrine, Kenji's control broke. "I cannot believe what you did back there," he burst out. "Have you no discipline? No respect for our vows? The rules are clear. We are forbidden from touching women. You carried her on your back as if you were a common porter. What will people think of our monastery if they hear of this?" Taizen had been drinking from his water gourd. He lowered it slowly and looked at Kenji with calm eyes. "Tell me," he said, "what did I do when we reached the other side of the stream?" Kenji frowned, thrown off by the question. "What do you mean?" "You put her down." "Exactly," Taizen nodded. "I put her down on the far bank, and she went on her way." "So why, my young brother, are you still carrying her?" The words landed like a stone in still water. Kenji opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. He looked at the path behind them, stretching empty and quiet through the forest. The rain had stopped completely now. Drops of water fell from the leaves overhead, catching the light. Somewhere nearby, a bird began to sing. Taizen shouldered his pack and continued up the path, his steps light despite his age. Kenji stood for a moment longer at the shrine, staring at nothing before following. They walked the rest of the way in silence, but it was a different kind of silence than before. This story shows us something about how we create our own suffering. Taizen carried the woman physically for maybe 30 seconds across a stream. Then he set her down and walked on, his mind completely free. Kenji, who never touched her at all, carried her mentally for hours, getting heavier with each step. The young monk thought he was protecting his practice and following the rules. Really, he was making himself miserable over something that had already ended. The woman was long gone, probably at home with her family. But in Kenji's mind, the stream crossing kept happening over and over. Zen Buddhism sees this pattern clearly. The original moment is rarely what hurts us. What happens afterward in our thoughts is where the real trouble starts. We replay conversations that ended hours ago. We go over moments of embarrassment or anger from yesterday, last week, even years past. These mental replays feel like we're dealing with the situation. Actually, we're just creating fresh pain in the present moment. Taizen's question cuts right through this habit. When we hold on to something mentally long after it's physically over, we're the ones making the burden. The person who upset us has moved on. The embarrassing moment is done. The difficult conversation ended. But we keep bringing these finished events back to life through our thoughts. What's interesting is that Kenji was carrying something that weighed nothing. An event that was over. A woman who was gone. His arms were empty, but his mind was full. This is what thoughts do when we give them too much power. They can make us tired from carrying air. Zen doesn't say we should ignore what happened or pretend difficult things didn't occur. Taizen didn't pretend he hadn't carried the woman. He just didn't need to carry her any further than the opposite bank. The action was complete. Why make it continue? This matters especially when we're trying to rest. The mind often becomes most active right when we finally lie down. Every unfinished conversation from the day comes back. Every awkward moment replays itself. Every worry about tomorrow shows up. We're like Kenji, carrying things that have already been set down. The practice isn't forcing thoughts away. That's just another kind of carrying. It's more like noticing when we're adding weight that doesn't need to be there. Oh, this is a memory, not something happening now. Oh, I'm rehearsing an argument that's already over. Just seeing this clearly can change something. What Zen Buddhism offers is permission to put things down, not by fighting them, but by recognizing that carrying them is a choice we keep making without realizing it. The moment passes on its own. We're the ones who keep calling it back. A merchant named Hiroshi had spent 30 years building his trading business. He started with nothing and worked his way up to 3 shops in different villages. He employed a dozen workers and made a decent living. One spring morning, Hiroshi prepared for his monthly journey to check on his businesses. He loaded his traveling pack carefully. Account books, letters to his shop managers, samples of goods, several strings of copper coins for payments. But as he lifted the pack, something felt wrong. It seemed heavier than usual, pulling at his shoulders with unexpected weight. He set it down and opened it, checking everything. Nothing was missing. Nothing extra. Yet, when he shouldered it again, the weight felt almost unbearable. His wife noticed his struggle. "Perhaps you're getting sick," she suggested. "Maybe you should rest today." But Hiroshi shook his head. His first shop was expecting a payment, and his second shop's manager had written with concerns that needed addressing. He couldn't delay. He adjusted the straps and set out. The path to the first village took him up a steep mountain trail. Normally, Hiroshi enjoyed this walk. The views were good, and the physical effort helped clear his mind for business. Today, every step felt hard. His breathing came heavy. His shoulders ached. The pack seemed to grow heavier with each hour. By the time he reached the first village, he was exhausted. He delivered the payment and checked the accounts, but his usual sharpness was gone. The shop manager asked him questions about ordering new stock, and Hiroshi found himself unable to think clearly. "Are you feeling well, Master Hiroshi?" the manager asked. "You look pale." "Just tired from the journey," Hiroshi replied. The pack was heavy today. He stayed the night at the village inn, hoping sleep would help. But the next morning, the pack felt even heavier. The walk to the second village took twice as long as usual. Hiroshi had to stop and rest every few hundred paces, setting the pack down before forcing himself to pick it up again. At the second shop, the manager was waiting with concerns about a supplier delivering poor quality goods. Normally, Hiroshi would have offered clear guidance. Today, his mind felt as heavy as his pack. He gave vague instructions and left quickly. The third village was still 2 days away. Hiroshi sat at a roadside shrine, looking at his pack with something close to despair. He couldn't continue like this. An old monk appeared on the path, walking easily despite his age. He carried nothing but a small bundle and a walking stick. When he saw Hiroshi slumped at the shrine, he paused. "You look troubled, friend," the monk said. Hiroshi gestured at his pack. This burden has become impossible. I don't know what's wrong with me. The monk studied the pack. May I? He asked, reaching for it. Hiroshi nodded. The monk lifted the pack easily, testing its weight. This is not particularly heavy, he observed. What's inside? Business items, Hiroshi said. Account books, letters, some coins. Nothing unusual. And yet it feels unbearable to you? For 2 days now, yes. The monk sat beside Hiroshi at the shrine. Tell me about your business. Hiroshi wasn't sure why he opened up to this stranger, but something about the monk's presence made it easy. He explained about his 3 shops, his employees, his responsibilities. And then, though he hadn't planned to, he found himself talking about his worries. The truth is, Hiroshi said slowly, I'm not sure any of this matters anymore. My eldest son has no interest in the business. He wants to become a scholar. My younger son is too wild. When I'm gone, everything I've built will probably fall apart. And even now, I see problems I can't solve. The shop in the second village is losing customers. The economy is changing. Merchants from the city are taking business from small traders like me. He continued, words tumbling out. I lie awake wondering if I've wasted my life. All this work, and for what? To leave my sons with businesses they don't want? To struggle against changes I can't control? When he finally stopped, the monk was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached over and began untying Hiroshi's pack. He opened it and carefully removed each item, setting them on the shrine's stone steps. Account books, letters, coins, fabric samples. Everything came out until the pack was completely empty. The monk held up the empty pack. Lift this, he said. Hiroshi took it, confused. It weighed almost nothing. Now, the monk said, tell me how this empty bag has been making your journey so difficult. Hiroshi stared at the pack in his hands. But it wasn't empty. All these things, he gestured at the items spread across the steps. These things? The monk asked, picking up an account book. This weighs maybe half a pound. And these coins? He lifted a string of copper. Less than a pound. Altogether, maybe 5 or 6 pounds. But it felt like 50 pounds, Hiroshi said. Yes, the monk agreed. Because you were carrying much more than what's in your pack. You've been carrying all your fears about the future, your worries about your sons, your doubts about whether your life matters, your struggles against changes you cannot control. These invisible weights are far heavier than any physical load. Hiroshi looked at his hands holding the empty pack. The monk's words hit him with unexpected force. The pack itself is light, the monk continued. It was always light. What makes you stumble is everything you've added to it in your mind. The monk began repacking Hiroshi's belongings, placing each item carefully back inside. Your business concerns are real. Your worries about your sons have reasons. But carrying these worries as you walk doesn't make them lighter. It only makes you heavier. Hiroshi watched as the monk closed the pack and held it out. Try again, the monk said. Hiroshi took the pack and lifted it to his shoulders. To his surprise, it felt different. Not exactly light, but bearable. Natural. The weight it should have been all along. The load hasn't changed, the monk observed. But perhaps how you're holding it has. Hiroshi stood at the shrine for a long time after the monk continued down the path. He looked at the mountains ahead, at the road to his third shop. The journey hadn't gotten shorter. The problems hadn't disappeared. But something had shifted. He adjusted his pack and started walking. This time, his steps were steady. This story reveals another layer of what Zen Buddhism sees about burden. Where Kenji carried a memory, Hiroshi carried something harder to see, worry about things that hadn't happened yet and couldn't be controlled. The empty pack is a perfect image for this. Hiroshi's business items had real weight, but that weight was manageable. What made the pack unbearable was everything he had unconsciously added to it. His fears for the future, his sense of wasted effort, his anxiety about changes beyond his reach. These invisible additions multiplied the actual weight many times over. This is remarkably common. We carry not just the actual demands of our lives, but layer upon layer of worry and fear about those demands. A simple meeting at work becomes heavy with anxiety about performance and what others think. A conversation with family carries the weight of old patterns and future expectations. Zen Buddhism helps us see the difference between the actual weight of our responsibilities and the added weight of our mental stories about them. Hiroshi really did have business concerns. His shops really needed attention. His sons really were making unexpected choices. But carrying anxiety about these facts didn't help anything. It only made him less able to address what actually needed his attention. The monk's demonstration with the empty pack cuts through this confusion simply. When Hiroshi saw the pack without its contents, he could feel directly how light it actually was. This helped him recognize how much extra weight he had been adding through his thoughts. But notice the monk didn't suggest Hiroshi abandon his responsibilities or stop caring about his business and family. The items went back in the pack. The journey continued. The difference was in how Hiroshi related to the actual weight versus the imagined weight. This matters especially at night. Nighttime seems to multiply our tendency to add invisible weight to life's actual demands. A problem that seemed manageable during the day can feel crushing when we're lying in the dark. Worries we kept in perspective while active suddenly seem urgent and overwhelming. What Zen sees is that if we had to solve every problem before we could feel peace, we would be trapped. Some concerns don't have quick solutions. Some worries are about things that haven't happened and may never happen. Some fears are about changes we genuinely cannot control. But recognizing the difference between the actual situation and our anxiety about the situation creates space for peace even when problems remain. Hiroshi's shops didn't suddenly become successful. His sons didn't transform. Yet he could walk on with a lighter step. The actual weight of this moment, right now, is probably much lighter than it feels. Most of what we're carrying is invisible, added by thoughts, sustained by worry. Seeing this clearly doesn't make us irresponsible. It makes us capable of responding to what's actually here instead of exhausting ourselves with what we imagine. The kitchen of Master Ren's tea house was always filled with steam and warmth. The scent of simmering broth hung in the air, mixing with the smell of fresh-cut vegetables and the faint char of the wood fire. The rhythmic sound of a knife against a cutting board provided a steady pulse to the room's activity. A young apprentice named Jiro had been assigned what seemed like the simplest task in the kitchen: stirring the soup. He stood by the great iron pot that hung over the fire, wooden spoon in hand, watching the broth swirl beneath his touch. The pot was large enough to feed everyone who came to the tea house that day, and it needed constant attention to keep the ingredients from settling and burning at the bottom. Jiro had been at the tea house for 3 months now. He had hoped to learn the art of tea preparation, the subtle movements and precise timing that Master Ren demonstrated with such grace. Instead, he found himself stirring soup, day after day, hour after hour. The same circular motion, over and over, until his arm ached and his mind grew numb with boredom. The day was ending. The sun cast amber light through the paper windows, creating soft rectangles of gold on the worn wooden floor. Most of the day's customers had come and gone. The tea house would close soon, and Jiro's arm was tired from stirring. His patience, never strong to begin with, had worn thin. He set down the spoon and approached Master Ren, who was arranging cups on a tray with his usual careful attention. Jiro tried to keep the frustration from his voice, but didn't quite succeed. "Master Ren, why must I stir this endlessly? The broth moves, yet nothing changes. I stir and stir, but the soup is the same. What am I learning from this?" Master Ren looked up from his work. His face was calm, showing neither approval nor disapproval. He was a man of perhaps 50 years, with silver streaking his dark hair and lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled often. He set down the tray and gestured for Jiro to follow him. They walked outside to the small garden behind the tea house. It was a simple space, just a few carefully placed stones, some bamboo, and a small pond that reflected the evening sky. The surface of the pond was perfectly still, like glass. Master Ren led Jiro to the edge of the water. Without speaking, Master Ren bent down and dipped his finger into the pond. He traced a slow circle in the water. Ripples spread outward from where his finger touched, moving in perfect rings. They distorted the reflection of the sky, breaking the clouds and the fading sunlight into fragments of light and color. The ripples moved outward and outward until they reached the edge of the pond, then gradually faded. The surface became still again, returning to its mirror-like calm. Jiro watched, puzzled. He waited for Master Ren to explain, to tell him what this demonstration meant. But the master simply looked at him with a gentle, questioning expression. "I don't understand," Jiro finally said. "The pond moves only when disturbed. Someone has to touch it to create the ripples." Master Ren nodded slowly. "And the soup?" "The soup is the same," Jiro replied, still not grasping the point. "It needs to be stirred or it will burn. It won't move on its own." "Are you certain?" Master Ren asked. Then he turned and walked back toward the tea house, leaving Jiro standing alone by the pond. Jiro stared at the still water. He looked at his own reflection, clear now that the ripples had faded. He thought about the soup sitting in its iron pot over the fire. He thought about all the hours he had spent stirring, convinced that without his constant motion, the soup would somehow fail. That night, as he returned to the pot for what he expected would be another hour of stirring, Jiro hesitated. His hand reached for the wooden spoon, but stopped before touching it. He stood beside the pot, simply watching. The steam rose in gentle curls, carrying the rich smell of vegetables and herbs. The fire crackled beneath the pot, its flames dancing in their constant, changing patterns. And in the depths of the pot, barely visible through the steam and the dim light, something moved. Jiro leaned closer, watching more carefully. The broth was moving on its own. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, it turned in a lazy spiral. The heat from the fire below created currents in the liquid. Warmer broth rose from the bottom, while cooler liquid descended from the top. The pot was stirring itself in its own way, following the natural patterns of heat and movement. Jiro stood there for a long time, just watching. The broth continued its slow circulation. Nothing burned. Nothing settled. The soup was doing exactly what it needed to do, and his constant stirring had been, if not unnecessary, then at least not as essential as he had believed. He picked up the spoon, but now his relationship to it had changed. He dipped it into the broth, but instead of his earlier forceful stirring, he moved it gently, following the existing currents rather than trying to create new ones. His motion joined with the soup's natural movement instead of fighting against it or ignoring it. Master Ren appeared in the doorway of the kitchen. He said nothing, but Jiro saw the slight nod of acknowledgement. The master had known all along what Jiro needed to discover, that sometimes our help becomes interference, that sometimes the best action is the smallest action, the one that works with what's already happening rather than imposing a new pattern. In the days that followed, Jiro's relationship with the soup pot changed entirely. He still stirred, but with a different quality of attention. He learned to feel when the broth needed encouragement and when it needed to be left alone. He discovered that there were rhythms to the cooking that he could join, but couldn't force. His arm stopped aching because he had stopped fighting against the natural movement of the liquid. More than that, something in his mind had shifted. He began to notice this same pattern everywhere. In the garden, plants grew at their own pace, regardless of how much he wished them to hurry. In the tea house, conversations between customers flowed in their own directions, following paths that couldn't be predetermined. Even in preparing tea, there was a point where all the careful preparation gave way to simply allowing the leaves to steep, to release their essence in their own time. Master Ren still hadn't taught him the formal tea ceremony, but Jiro was beginning to understand that perhaps he was learning something more fundamental. Something about the difference between doing and overdoing. About recognizing when to act and when to allow. About the wisdom of sometimes stepping back and trusting that processes have their own intelligence. This story contains something central to Zen Buddhism's teaching about action. We live in a world that constantly tells us to do more, try harder, stay busy, keep moving. We believe that our worth comes from our constant activity, that if we're not actively making things happen, we're somehow failing. But notice what Jiro discovered. The soup didn't need his constant, forceful stirring. It had its own way of moving, created by the natural physics of heat and liquid. His stirring wasn't wrong, but his belief that the soup couldn't function without it was mistaken. He was adding effort where less effort would serve better. This is what Zen calls Wu Wei, often translated as non-doing or effortless action. It doesn't mean doing nothing. It means not adding unnecessary action to what's already happening naturally. It means learning to feel the difference between helpful engagement and interference disguised as help. Think about how much energy we spend in forceful stirring. We try to make relationships develop faster than they naturally would. We push against our own creative processes, demanding immediate results. We attempt to force solutions to problems that might resolve themselves if given time and space. We stay busy with motion that creates the illusion of progress, while actually preventing natural development. Jiro's tired arm was a signal. His frustration was a signal. These were signs that he was working against something rather than with it. But we often ignore these signals, thinking that difficulty means we need to try harder, that resistance means we need to push more forcefully. What Master Ren showed with the pond was elegant. A finger touching water creates ripples. Remove the finger and the ripples fade. The water returns to stillness on its own. No one needs to make it calm again. This is the nature of things when left to follow their own course. The soup, too, had its own nature. Heat rises. Cooler liquid descends. This creates circulation without anyone forcing it. Jiro's role wasn't to create this movement, but to work gently with it, to guide it slightly when needed, to trust it most of the time. This teaching appears throughout Zen Buddhism. The best action often feels effortless because it's aligned with what wants to happen anyway. A skilled craftsman's hands move almost automatically, not from mindless repetition, but from deep understanding of the material. A gardener learns when to prune and when to let growth take its course. A teacher knows when to speak and when to remain silent, trusting the student's own process of understanding. What changes isn't that we stop acting. Jiro still stirred the soup, but the quality of action transforms. Instead of forceful imposition, there's gentle cooperation. Instead of constant interference, there's trust in natural processes with occasional guidance. Instead of exhausting ourselves with unnecessary effort, we learn to recognize where our energy actually serves. A traveler named Sora stood at the edge of the bamboo bridge, watching it sway in the wind. The bridge stretched across a wide river gorge, connecting the path she was on to the continuation of the trail on the other side. It was the only way forward. The only way back was 3 days of walking. The rain had passed through that morning, leaving everything wet and shining. But the river below still churned violently, swollen with runoff from the mountains. The water was brown and fast, carrying broken branches and debris. The sound of it filled the air, a constant roar that spoke of power and danger. The bridge itself was made of bamboo poles lashed together with rope, with bamboo railings on either side. It was a local construction, probably rebuilt every few years as the old materials wore out. Right now, it swayed back and forth in the wind that funneled through the gorge. Not dramatically, but enough to make Sora's stomach tighten with fear. She had crossed bridges before. Many bridges, but always sturdy ones, made of stone or heavy timber. This bamboo construction looked so fragile, so temporary. She could see through the gaps between the poles to the churning water far below. The whole thing moved like something alive, responding to every gust of wind. An old ferryman emerged from a small hut built into the cliff face nearby. Sora hadn't noticed the hut until he appeared. He was weathered and lean, with skin darkened by years in the sun and wind. He carried a wooden bucket and moved with the careful balance of someone who had spent his life in unstable places. "Excuse me," Sora called to him. "This bridge, is it safe? It looks so unsteady." The ferryman paused and looked at her. Then he looked at the bridge with an expression that suggested he had seen it 1,000 times and found nothing remarkable about it. He set down his bucket and walked to the edge of the path. Without a word, he picked up a fallen leaf from the ground, one of the many that had been stripped from the trees by the morning rain. He walked onto the bridge, his feet finding the bamboo poles with practiced ease and placed the leaf on the surface about halfway across. The bridge swayed beneath him. The leaf trembled, then settled. The ferryman walked back to solid ground and looked at Sora with raised eyebrows, as if to say, "See?" But Sora shook her head. A leaf is not a person. A leaf weighs nothing. How do I know the bridge will hold me? The ferryman picked up his bucket and gestured toward the river gorge below. "Is the water solid?" he asked. His voice was rough from disuse, like he didn't speak often. Sora frowned at the question. "Of course not. Water is always moving." "And yet," the ferryman said, "does it not hold the boats?" He pointed downriver where, in the distance, she could see the tiny shape of a boat navigating the current. Before she could respond, he walked back to his hut and disappeared inside, apparently done with the conversation. Sora stood alone at the bridge's edge. The wind sighed through the bamboo, making the poles creak and the rope groan. The leaf still lay where the ferryman had placed it, undisturbed despite the bridge's movement. She thought about the ferryman's question. Water wasn't solid, yet boats floated on it. Water was always moving, always changing, yet it could be trusted to support what rested on its surface. The boat didn't need the water to be still or solid. It only needed to work with the water's nature, to move as the water moved. Sora looked at the bridge again. It swayed because it was flexible. If it were rigid, the wind might break it. Its movement was its strength, not its weakness. It could bend without breaking, shift without failing. She took a deep breath and placed one foot onto the first bamboo pole. It held her weight easily. The bridge swayed slightly, responding to her presence, but it didn't feel dangerous. It felt responsive, alive, aware of her in some way. She placed her other foot forward. The bridge continued to sway gently. She could feel it moving beneath her, adjusting to her weight, distributing the load across its structure. It was unsettling at first, this constant motion. But as she took another step, and then another, she began to understand. The trick wasn't to fight the movement. It was to move with it. When the bridge swayed left, she leaned slightly left. When it swayed right, she adjusted right. Her body began to find its own rhythm with the bridge's rhythm. They were dancing together, in a sense, each responding to the other. Halfway across, she reached the leaf. She paused there, looking down at it. The leaf had known something she was only now learning. It didn't resist the bridge's movement. It simply rested there, light and trusting, moving when the bridge moved, still when the bridge was still. She continued to the other side, her steps growing more confident. By the time she reached the far edge and stepped onto solid ground again, something had changed. Not in the bridge. In her. She turned and looked back across the gorge. The bridge still swayed in the wind. It looked just as unstable as it had before. But she no longer saw it as dangerous. She saw it as wise, as perfectly designed for the forces it had to navigate. Its flexibility was what allowed it to survive in this wind-torn gorge. A rigid bridge would have been destroyed long ago. Sora continued on her journey, but she carried the bridge's teaching with her. That sometimes what looks unstable is actually more trustworthy than what appears solid. That flexibility can be stronger than rigidity. That moving with something is often safer than trying to remain completely still. This story touches something essential in Zen Buddhism's understanding of how to live. We spend so much energy trying to create stability, trying to build lives that won't move or change or sway. We want solid ground beneath our feet at all times. We want certainty, security, permanence. But the bridge teaches a different wisdom. It teaches that flexibility is strength, that what bends can survive forces that would break rigid structures. That trust sometimes means accepting movement rather than demanding stillness. Sora's fear at the bridge's edge was natural. Our instinct is to trust what feels solid and fear what moves. But notice what the ferryman revealed. The leaf rested on the swaying bridge without fear. The boat floated on moving water without sinking. Neither needed stillness to be safe. They needed only to work with the movement rather than against it. Think about the areas of life where we demand solidity. Relationships must never change. Jobs must provide permanent security. Understanding must be fixed and final. But life isn't built that way. Relationships grow and shift. Work changes. Understanding deepens and sometimes has to be revised. When we insist that these things remain rigid, we create suffering for ourselves. Sora's journey across wasn't about conquering her fear through force of will. It was about learning to move differently. When she stopped resisting the bridge's sway and started moving with it, the crossing became not just possible but natural. Her body found its rhythm with the bridge's rhythm. They collaborated rather than fought. This teaching appears everywhere in Zen practice. In meditation, we learn that thoughts will move through the mind like wind through a gorge. We can exhaust ourselves trying to make the mind completely still, or we can learn to sit peacefully while thoughts come and go. In daily life, we can rage against change and uncertainty, or we can develop the flexibility to move with them. What makes this difficult is that flexibility requires trust. Sora had to trust the bridge before she could learn to move with it. She had to take that first step without certainty about what would happen. This is the leap that Zen often asks of us. Not blind trust, but trust earned through testing, through actually stepping onto the bridge and discovering that it holds. This is how we learn to trust life's instability. Not through believing it will suddenly become stable, but through discovering we can find our balance within the movement. The bridge will always sway. The water will always flow. The question is whether we can dance with this reality or whether we'll spend our lives frozen at the edge, demanding a solidity that doesn't exist. In the mountains beyond the temple, a master archer named Kai practiced in solitude. His name was known in the valley below. Travelers spoke of his skill with quiet respect. Every arrow found its mark. Every shot was perfect in form and execution. The practice ground was a clearing in the forest, surrounded by ancient pines. A wooden target stood at the far end, its center marked by rings of red and white paint. The paint was fresh because Kai replaced the target often. His arrows had a way of destroying what they struck. A wandering monk appeared one afternoon, drawn by the rhythmic sound of arrows hitting wood. He stood at the edge of the clearing, watching in silence. Kai continued his practice, unaware or unconcerned with the observer. Draw, aim, release. Draw, aim, release. Each arrow flew straight and true, sinking into the target's center with a solid thunk. After perhaps 20 arrows, Kai paused. He walked to the target to retrieve them, pulling each one free with a slight twist. As he returned to his shooting position, he noticed the monk. "Your aim is flawless," the monk said. "Each shot perfect." Kai nodded, accepting the compliment without false modesty. He had worked many years to achieve this level of skill. Thousands of hours of practice, his muscles trained to move with precision, his mind trained to focus without wavering. "But is it effortless?" the monk asked. Kai frowned. "What do you mean? I have trained for years to perfect my technique." The monk bent down and picked up a small twig from the forest floor. Without warning, he tossed it into the air. The wind caught it immediately, sending it tumbling and spinning through the clearing. It rose, twisted, turned, and finally landed softly on a bed of pine needles. "The twig has no training," the monk observed. "Yet it follows its path perfectly." Kai set down his bow. A twig is not an arrow. A twig is carried by the wind. An arrow must be guided by the archer. Without guidance, it flies wild and misses the target. The monk smiled, a gentle expression that held no mockery. "Then shoot without guiding." Kai almost laughed. "That makes no sense." The whole art of archery is in the guidance. The stance, the draw, the aim, the release. Every element carefully controlled. "Try," the monk said simply. Then he walked to the edge of the clearing and sat down against a tree, apparently content to watch whatever would happen next. Kai looked at his bow, then at the target. He had spent years perfecting his control over every aspect of the shot. Now this monk wanted him to release that control? It seemed absurd. But something in the monk's quiet confidence made him curious. He nocked another arrow and lifted the bow. He drew back the string to his anchor point, his form perfect as always. He aimed at the target's center, his eye finding the exact point he wanted to hit. And then, as he began to release, he tried to let go of the guidance. To just release without that final moment of adjustment that he always made. His fingers twitched. The arrow veered slightly, missing the center by several inches. It still hit the target, but it was far from his usual standard. Kai lowered his bow, frustrated. The monk said nothing, just watched with that same gentle smile. Kai tried again. Drew, aimed, released. This time, he was more aware of all the tiny adjustments he made. The slight shift of his shoulder to compensate for wind. The minute change in his hand position to correct the arrow's flight. The unconscious calculation that happened in the moment before release. So many tiny interventions, all happening so fast he normally didn't notice them. When he tried to stop making these adjustments, to just let the arrow fly, it felt wrong. Uncontrolled. Dangerous. He tried a third time, then a fourth. Each shot was worse than his normal standard. The monk continued sitting, apparently in no hurry. Finally, Kai set down his bow and walked over to where the monk sat. "I don't understand what you're asking. How can I shoot without guidance? The guidance is what makes the shot accurate." The monk gestured at the forest around them. "Watch the trees for a moment." Kai looked. The wind was moving through the pines, bending their branches, making them sway. But the trees weren't resisting. They weren't trying to stay rigid against the wind's force. They bent, flexed, moved with each gust. And when the gust passed, they returned to their natural position. "The trees don't guide the wind," the monk said. "They don't try to control it. But they also don't break. They've learned to move with forces they cannot control." That night, after the monk had continued on his way, Kai sat in his small house with his bow across his lap. He thought about the twig flying, about the trees bending, about all his careful control and what it might be costing him. His practice had become so focused on perfection that perhaps he had lost something. Some quality of naturalness, of flow. His shots hit the target, yes. But they came from pure technique, from the conscious application of learned skill. Was there another way? A way that included skill but wasn't bound by it? Over the following weeks, Kai began to practice differently. He still maintained his form, still aimed carefully. But he tried to release his grip on the outcome, to set up the shot properly and then trust it, rather than trying to control every fraction of an inch of the arrow's flight. It was harder than he expected. His mind wanted to interfere, to make those last-moment adjustments. But gradually, he learned to step back from that urge, to prepare everything correctly, and then let the arrow find its own way. The strange thing was, his accuracy didn't decrease. If anything, it improved. The arrows flew with a quality they hadn't had before. Something more relaxed, more natural. As if the arrow itself knew where to go once he stopped trying to force it. One day, many months later, Kai was practicing when he noticed the wind picking up. He watched a leaf fall from a tree, spiraling down through the air, landing exactly where it needed to land. Not where someone had decided it should land, just where it landed. He nocked an arrow, drew the bow, aimed, and then, instead of releasing with his usual control, he simply opened his fingers. Let the arrow go, the way the tree let the leaf go, trusting it to find its path. The arrow flew straight and true, sinking into the target center with perfect precision. But the shot had felt different, effortless. Not because it required no effort, but because the effort had become so aligned with the action that they were no longer separate things. Kai smiled. The monk's teaching had taken root in its own time, in its own way. Like everything else, it couldn't be forced, only allowed. This story reveals another layer of what Zen Buddhism teaches about action and control. Kai's problem wasn't that he was skilled. Skill is valuable, the result of dedicated practice and attention. His problem was that his skill had become rigid, bound by the very control that had created it. The monk's challenge was subtle. He wasn't suggesting that Kai abandon technique or stop aiming. He was pointing to something beyond technique, a quality of action that includes skill but isn't imprisoned by it. Effortless action doesn't mean unskilled action. It means action where the skill has become so natural that it no longer requires constant conscious control. Think about learning any skill. At first, everything is awkward and requires intense focus. Learning to drive, you think about every movement. Check the mirror, press the brake, turn the wheel. Each action is separate, deliberate, controlled. But eventually, if you continue long enough, something shifts. The actions become fluid. You drive without thinking about driving. Your body knows what to do. This is what the monk was pointing toward. Kai had learned the technique perfectly. Now he needed to learn to let the technique work through him rather than constantly managing it. The twig flying through the air showed the principle. The twig didn't try to fly well. It simply responded to each force that moved it, and the result was perfect flight. Not perfect according to some external standard, but perfect in the sense of being completely natural. What makes this difficult is that it requires trust. Kai had to trust his training enough to let go of conscious control. He had to risk imperfection in order to find a deeper kind of perfection. This is terrifying for anyone who has worked hard to achieve mastery. What if letting go means losing what we've worked so hard to gain? But Zen sees that true mastery includes letting go. As long as we're gripping the technique, controlling every detail, we're separate from the action. There's the archer and the bow and the target, all separate things being managed by the conscious mind. In effortless action, these separations dissolve. The archer, bow, arrow, and target become one flowing movement. This doesn't happen through force or technique. Kai couldn't practice his way into effortlessness by trying harder to be effortless. That's just more effort, more control. Instead, he had to create the conditions where effortlessness could arise naturally. He had to perfect his technique and then learn to trust it enough to stop interfering. Notice that his accuracy actually improved when he stopped trying to control everything. This reveals something important. Often our controlling, our constant adjustments and interventions are actually preventing the natural excellence that wants to emerge. We think we're helping, but we're interfering. This appears everywhere in life. Parents who control every aspect of their children's lives prevent them from developing their own judgment. Leaders who micromanage their teams prevent natural competence from expressing itself. We ourselves often interfere with our own natural wisdom by overthinking, overanalyzing, trying to manage every outcome. What Zen teaches is that there's a place beyond technique where technique becomes transparent. The skill is still there, all the training and practice hasn't disappeared. But it's no longer being wielded consciously. It's become part of your natural way of moving through the world. The arrow knows where to go because you've trained so well that your body understands at a level deeper than conscious thought. This is what the monk meant by shooting without guiding. Not shooting randomly or carelessly, but shooting from such deep understanding that conscious guidance is no longer necessary. The guidance has become internal, natural, effortless. For those of us trying to rest at night, this teaching has particular relevance. We often approach sleep the way Kai initially approached archery. We try to control it, manage it, make it happen through effort and technique. We have our routines and our methods and our determination to sleep well. But the more we try to control sleep, the more it eludes us. Sleep, like the best arrow flight, happens when we stop trying to make it happen. When we create the right conditions and then trust, letting go of control, allowing the natural process to unfold. The twig doesn't fly by trying to fly. The arrow doesn't hit the target by forcing itself toward it. And sleep doesn't come through effort. It comes through surrender, through trusting the body's natural wisdom enough to release conscious control and let rest arrive in its own way. A painter named Yuki sat in the village square, her long scroll spread across a wooden table. She had been working since dawn, and the day was now past its midpoint. The sun hung warm overhead, and the square was busy with the usual afternoon activity. Merchants closing their stalls for the midday rest. Children playing near the well. Old men gathered under the shade tree, talking in voices that rose and fell like a gentle tide. Yuki worked with careful attention, her brush moving across the rice paper in deliberate strokes. Black ink flowed from the brush, creating a landscape that seemed to emerge from nothing. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks suggested with just a few lines. A river wound through the valley, its current visible in the way the ink captured movement. A single crane stood in the water, one leg lifted, its long neck curved in that moment before flight. Hours of work had gone into this painting. She had ground the ink herself that morning, mixing it to exactly the right consistency. Each brushstroke had been considered, placed with precision. She painted in the traditional style, where nothing could be erased or corrected. Each mark was permanent. You had to get it right the first time. Villagers had gathered to watch, as they often did when Yuki painted in the square. They stood in a quiet semicircle, respectful of her concentration but drawn by the beauty emerging on the scroll. An old woman brought her tea without asking. A child reached out to touch the paper but was gently pulled back by his mother. The painting was nearly complete. Yuki was adding the final details, small touches that would bring the whole composition into balance. A few reeds near the crane's feet. The suggestion of mist where mountain met sky. The subtle indication of the crane's reflection in the water. The sky began to darken. Yuki glanced up, noticing the clouds that had moved in from the west. They looked heavy, full of rain. But she was so close to finishing. Just a few more strokes. A few more minutes. She bent back to her work, her brush hovering over the paper as she considered where to place the next mark. A single raindrop landed on the scroll, right in the middle of the river. The black ink began to spread where the water touched it, the careful line she had drawn blurring outward in a sudden bloom. Then another drop fell, and another. Yuki's hand froze. She looked up at the sky, which had gone from light grey to dark in what seemed like seconds. The rain was coming, and coming fast. She should grab the scroll, roll it up, run for shelter. Save what she could of the painting. But something stopped her. She just watched as more drops fell, each one landing on the paper, each one transforming the image she had so carefully created. The villagers stepped back, uncertain. Some held out their hands to catch the rain, looking up at the sky with worried expressions. The old woman who had brought tea started to reach for the scroll, meaning to help, but Yuki shook her head slightly. No. Leave it. The rain fell harder. The black ink began to run, rivers of it flowing across the paper, following the texture of the rice paper, finding paths that Yuki had never intended. The mountains started to blur and melt. The crane lost its sharp edges, its form becoming softer, more suggestive. The water in the painting mixed with the real water falling from the sky until it was hard to tell where ink ended and rain began. Yuki stayed in her seat, watching. Her hands rested on her lap, her brush set down on the table. The rain soaked her hair, her clothes, but she didn't move. She just watched her painting transform under forces beyond her control. The river she had painted so carefully became wider, wilder. The ink spread across the paper, creating new patterns, new shapes. Dark pools formed where water collected. Pale streaks appeared where the rain washed the ink away almost entirely. The crane was barely visible now, just a ghost of a shape, more dream than bird. The villagers began to drift away, seeking shelter from the rain. The old woman hesitated, looked at Yuki one more time, then hurried toward an awning. The children were called home by their mothers. Soon Yuki sat alone in the square, rain falling steadily, the scroll before her no longer recognizable as the painting she had begun. She watched for a long time, just sitting in the rain, watching the transformation continue. The paper began to tear in places, weakened by the water. More ink washed away. What remained was strange, beautiful in a way she hadn't intended, could never have planned. Finally, the rain began to ease. The heavy downpour became a light drizzle, then stopped altogether. Clouds parted, and the sun appeared, low in the sky now, casting golden light across the wet square. Everything gleamed. Puddles reflected the sky. The air smelled clean and alive. Yuki looked at what remained of her painting. The scroll was ruined, at least in the conventional sense. The image she had worked all day to create was gone. But something else had taken its place. The rain had created its own painting, using her ink and her paper, but following its own vision. She reached out slowly and traced her finger along one of the paths the rain had carved through the ink. Her finger came away black, the wet ink staining her skin. She looked at the mark on her finger, then back at the scroll. Then, in a movement that surprised even herself, she dipped her finger in a puddle of ink that had collected in one corner of the scroll. She brought her finger to the paper and began to draw, not trying to restore what had been lost, not fighting against what the rain had done. Instead, she worked with it. She followed the lines the rain had created, extending them, completing patterns the water had started but left unfinished. Her hand moved differently now, not with the careful precision of before, but with a kind of flowing response to what was already there. She was collaborating with the rain, finishing a painting they had created together. The villagers began to emerge from their shelters, coming back to see what had happened. They gathered around Yuki again, watching as she worked with her finger, her brush forgotten. They didn't know what to make of what they were seeing. Was she painting or only watching? Was this a new work or the ruins of the old one? No one could say for certain. Perhaps not even Yuki herself. When she finally stood up, her clothes still damp, her finger stained with ink, the sun was setting. The scroll remained on the table, this strange hybrid creation born from intention and accident, from human design and natural force. It wasn't what she had planned to make, but it was complete in its own way. An old scholar who had watched the whole thing from beneath an awning approached slowly. He looked at the scroll for a long time without speaking. Then he looked at Yuki. "Is it finished?" he asked. Yuki smiled. "I don't know. Is the rain finished?" The scholar smiled back, understanding. He bowed to her and walked away, leaving Yuki alone with her transformed painting. She rolled up the scroll carefully, this thing that was both destroyed and created, both loss and gift. She carried it home as the last light faded from the sky, already wondering what it would show her when she unrolled it the next day. This story speaks to the heart of Zen Buddhism's teaching about impermanence and attachment. Yuki spent hours creating something beautiful, something she had imagined and worked to bring into existence. And then, in minutes, it was transformed into something entirely different. Her initial impulse must have been what any of us would feel. Protect the work. Save what can be saved. The painting represented hours of effort, skill, vision. To watch it destroyed would be heartbreaking for any artist. But notice what actually happened. Yuki didn't fight against the rain. She didn't grab the scroll and run. She watched. She allowed the transformation to occur. And in that allowing, something unexpected emerged. This is what Zen means when it talks about non-attachment. Not that we shouldn't care about things or put effort into creating beauty. Yuki clearly cared deeply about her work. She had spent hours on that painting. But she wasn't so attached to her vision that she couldn't allow it to change. She wasn't so invested in the outcome that she had to protect it from transformation. We spend so much of our lives trying to prevent change. We create something and want it to stay exactly as we made it. We build relationships and want them to remain frozen in their best moments. We establish routines and fight against anything that disrupts them. We grip tightly to how things are, or how we wish they were, terrified of the rain that might transform everything. But change comes regardless. Life is rain falling on our carefully painted scrolls. Jobs end. Relationships shift. Our bodies age. Plans fail. The unexpected arrives and transforms what we work to create. We can spend our energy trying to prevent this, trying to keep everything exactly as we want it, or we can learn what Yuki discovered in the square. That sometimes loss creates possibility. Sometimes the most beautiful things emerge from collaboration with forces beyond our control. This teaching has profound implications for how we live. Most of our suffering comes from wanting things to stay the same when everything in the universe is constantly changing. We want the good moments to last forever. We want the difficult moments to end immediately. We want control over outcomes that are actually beyond our influence. Zen Buddhism suggests a different relationship with change. Not fighting it, not being destroyed by it, but learning to move with it. Learning to see what possibilities open when things don't go as planned. Learning to collaborate with the unexpected rather than being defeated by it. The painting Under the Rain becomes a metaphor for all of life. We all have our visions, our plans, our careful intentions, and life rains on them. Always. The question isn't whether change will come. It's how we meet it when it does. A potter named Hiroshi worked at his wheel in the quiet of early morning. His hands moved with practiced confidence, shaping wet clay into a vessel. The wheel turned steadily beneath his touch, powered by a foot pedal that he worked without thinking. The clay rose and fell, widened and narrowed, responding to the subtle pressure of his fingers. A young apprentice named Jun watched from the doorway. He had been studying with Hiroshi for 6 months now, learning the basics of wedging clay and preparing glazes. But he hadn't yet been allowed to work on the wheel. That honor came only after proving dedication and understanding. After showing that you truly wanted to learn. Jun's gaze was intense, reverent. He watched every movement of the master's hands, trying to memorize the technique. How Hiroshi's thumbs pressed into the center of the clay to create the opening. How his fingers pulled the walls upward, thinning them gradually, creating height and shape from a lump of formless earth. "Master," Jun said softly, not wanting to disturb the work but unable to contain his question. "How do you make something that will last forever?" Hiroshi paused in his work, his hands stilling on the wet clay. The wheel continued to turn for a moment, then slowly stopped. He looked at the jar taking shape beneath his fingers, then at his young apprentice. Forever? He repeated. Then he smiled, gentle and knowing. Fire will decide that. He shaped the rim of the jar with his thumb, creating a subtle outward curve. He smoothed the surface with a wet sponge, removing any rough spots or imperfections. When he was satisfied, he cut the base of the jar free from the wheel using a thin wire, then carefully lifted the piece and carried it to a shelf where it would dry. "This one is ready," he said to Jun. "Help me load the kiln." Yun jumped to obey, eager to be useful. Together, they carried the jar and several other pieces that had dried over the previous days to the large kiln that stood behind the workshop. The kiln was a traditional design built of brick and clay, tall enough for a man to stand in. It had taken Hiroshi years to build it, learning from other potters how to construct it properly, how to ensure even heat, how to create the right conditions for transformation. They loaded the pieces carefully, placing them on shelves inside the kiln, spacing them so the heat could circulate freely. The jar Jun had watched being made sat in a place of honor on the middle shelf. When everything was loaded, Hiroshi sealed the kiln's door with wet clay, leaving only the firebox opening at the bottom. "Now we wait," Hiroshi said. "The fire takes time to do its work." But Jun was too excited to wait patiently. He had seen the master create something beautiful, and now that beauty would be made permanent through fire. The soft, fragile clay would become hard, strong, able to hold water and withstand use. The jar would last for years, maybe generations. It would be something permanent in a changing world. They fed the fire slowly, gradually raising the temperature. The kiln needed to heat evenly, not too fast, or the pieces inside might crack. Throughout the day and into the night, they took turns watching the fire, adding wood, monitoring the color of the flames and the heat radiating from the kiln's walls. Jun barely slept that night. He dozed by the workshop fire, waking every hour to check the kiln, to add more wood when needed. He imagined the jar in the darkness and heat, transforming from soft clay into permanent ceramic. He thought about how he would learn to make such pieces himself someday, how he would create objects of beauty that would outlast their makers. By dawn, the firing was complete. The kiln had reached its peak temperature and held it for the required time. Now it needed to cool slowly, carefully, for at least a full day before it could be opened. Opening it too soon would shock the pieces inside, crack them with the sudden change in temperature. Jun could barely contain his impatience through that long day of waiting. He circled the kiln, checked it repeatedly, pressed his hand against the bricks to feel the heat gradually dissipating. Hiroshi went about his other work calmly, wedging new clay, preparing glazes, sweeping the workshop floor. He had been through this process hundreds of times. He knew that patience was as important as skill. Finally, as the sun was setting on the second day, Hiroshi nodded. "It's time." Together, they carefully removed the clay seal from the kiln door. Heat still radiated from inside, but gentle now, no longer dangerous. They opened the door slowly, letting the last of the heat escape gradually. Yun peered into the dim interior, eager to see the results. But something was wrong. The middle shelf where the jar had sat was empty, except for a pile of grey dust and broken fragments. "No," Jun whispered. He reached in carefully and brought out a handful of ashes. This was all that remained of the beautiful jar he had watched the master create. All that work for nothing. Hiroshi knelt beside the pile of ashes that Jun had set on the ground. He ran his fingers through them gently, letting the fine dust sift between his hands. The ashes were soft, pale grey, warm still from the kiln's heat. "Nothing?" Hiroshi asked quietly. Jun gestured helplessly at the ashes. "The jar is destroyed. We worked so hard, and now there's only dust." Hiroshi lifted a handful of ashes and held them up in the fading light. The dust caught the last rays of the sun, glowing softly. He opened his hand and let the ashes drift through his fingers, falling back to the ground in a small grey cloud. "Look how they move," Hiroshi said. "Like smoke. Like mist." Jun didn't understand. He saw only failure, only loss. The jar was supposed to survive the fire, to become permanent and strong. Instead, it had been reduced to this weightless powder. "The clay came from the earth," Hiroshi continued, his voice gentle, thoughtful. "Now it returns to the earth in a different form. Is this nothing? Or is it completion?" He stood and walked back to his workshop, leaving Jun sitting beside the pile of ashes. The young apprentice stayed there as darkness fell, looking at the dust, trying to understand what his teacher meant. After a long time, a breeze stirred through the courtyard. It caught some of the ashes and lifted them into the air. Jun watched them drift upward, swirling in the wind, catching the light from the workshop windows. The ashes danced, weightless and free, before settling back to earth a few feet away. He thought about the jar as it had been on the wheel. Beautiful, yes, but also heavy, solid, fixed in its form. The ashes had no form, no weight. They could be anything, go anywhere. The wind could carry them. Rain could dissolve them. They could feed the soil, become part of new growth. Was this destruction or transformation? He didn't know anymore. The jar was gone, but something remained. Not nothing, just different from what he had expected. He scooped up some of the ashes and carried them to the garden behind the workshop. There he scattered them around the base of a young tree that Hiroshi had planted the previous spring. The ashes disappeared into the soil, invisible, becoming part of earth again. The next morning, Hiroshi was already at his wheel when Jun arrived. A new lump of clay sat centered, ready to be shaped. The master's hands moved over it with the same gentle confidence as always, beginning the process of transformation once more. Jun picked up a ball of clay from the wedging table and began working it with his hands, preparing it. The clay was cool and damp, alive in his palms. He knew now that whatever he made from it would be temporary. Even if it survived the fire, even if it lasted for years, eventually it would return to dust. But somehow, this knowledge didn't make the work feel pointless. If anything, it made each piece more precious. Not despite its impermanence, but because of it. This story reveals another dimension of Zen Buddhism's teaching about impermanence. Where Yuki's painting was transformed by rain, the jar was completely returned to its elemental form by fire. And Jun had to learn what this meant. His question about making something that lasts forever came from a deep human longing. We want to create things that will outlive us. We want permanence in a world where everything changes. We want to matter in a lasting way. Hiroshi's answer was perfect. Fire will decide. Not the potter. The master can have all the skill in the world, all the care and attention, but ultimately there are forces beyond his control that will determine what survives and what returns to earth. Jun saw this as failure because he was thinking in terms of the jar as an object, a thing that should exist permanently. But Hiroshi saw it differently. The jar was always just a temporary form that clay took. Before it was a jar, it was a lump of formless earth. After the fire, it returned to a different version of earth. The ashes weren't the death of the jar. They were the next phase of the clay's existence. This is what Zen means by impermanence as transformation rather than loss. Nothing is ever truly destroyed. Things only change form. The question isn't whether things will last forever, because nothing does. The question is whether we can appreciate them in their current form without needing them to be permanent. Yoon thought the ashes were nothing because they couldn't hold water or serve the function a jar is meant to serve. But Hiroshi saw them as beautiful in their own right. Light enough to dance in the wind, capable of nourishing the soil, transformed but not destroyed. When Jun scattered the ashes around the tree, he participated in this understanding. The clay that was meant to become a jar would instead become part of the tree's growth. It would feed leaves, contribute to flowers, support fruit. Not the permanence he imagined, but perhaps something better. Continued existence through endless transformation. This teaching challenges how we think about success and failure, creation and destruction. We judge outcomes based on whether things turn out as we planned. The jar was supposed to survive the fire and become a permanent object. When that didn't happen, Jun saw only failure. But from a larger perspective, everything happened exactly as it should. The clay went through its process. The fire revealed the clay's nature. The ashes returned to earth and continued their existence in new forms. We do this constantly in our own lives. We have plans and expectations. When reality doesn't match them, we feel we've failed, that something has gone wrong. But perhaps things are simply transforming in ways we hadn't anticipated. Perhaps the ashes of our failed plans can nourish growth we never imagined. The most powerful moment in the story is Hiroshi returning to his wheel the next morning, beginning again. He didn't stop creating because one piece became ashes. He understood that creation and dissolution are partners, not opponents. You can't have one without the other. Every jar will eventually return to earth. Does that make making jars pointless? Or does it make each jar more precious because it's temporary? For those of us trying to rest at night, this teaching offers profound freedom. We often lie awake worrying about what we're building, what we're trying to preserve, what might be lost. We grip tightly to outcomes, to plans, to the things we've created. But everything, eventually, returns to ashes. Not as tragedy, but as natural process. What would it mean to create and live and love with the knowledge that nothing lasts forever? Not with despair, but with appreciation. Not holding less tightly because things don't matter, but holding more gently because they matter deeply and are here only for a time. The jar that became ashes taught more than a jar that survived ever could have. Yoon learned that beauty isn't diminished by being temporary. That transformation isn't the same as destruction. That ashes too have their place and purpose. That every ending is also a beginning of something else. The wheel keeps turning. The clay keeps transforming. The fire keeps burning. And in this endless cycle of creation and dissolution, there's a peace that comes from accepting rather than fighting, from appreciating each form while it lasts, then letting it go when it's time. from understanding that nothing is ever truly lost, only changed. A young monk named Takashi arrived at a secluded monastery high in the mountains. The journey had taken him 3 days of walking steep paths, his legs aching by the time he finally saw the monastery gates. He had heard of this place from other monks, whispered about as somewhere special, though no one could quite explain why. The monastery was simple, built of dark wood and stone. Prayer flags snapped in the constant mountain wind. Gardens grew vegetables and herbs. A small stream provided water. Everything was spare, functional, beautiful in its simplicity. But what caught Takashi's attention immediately was the bell. It stood in the center of the courtyard, massive and bronze. As tall as a man, its surface was covered with intricate carvings of clouds and cranes and mountains. It hung from a wooden frame so old the wood had turned almost black. Beside it rested a heavy wooden mallet, its striking surface worn smooth from what must have been centuries of use. Takashi approached an elder monk who was sweeping the courtyard. "That bell," he said, unable to hide his awe. "It's magnificent. When does it ring?" The elder monk looked up from his sweeping. His face was weathered and peaceful, creased with lines that suggested many years and many smiles. "It does not," he said simply. Takashi frowned. "I don't understand. You have this beautiful bell, this mallet ready beside it. Why have a bell that is never rung?" The elder monk returned to his sweeping, his broom making soft swishing sounds across the stone. He offered no explanation, just continued his work as if Takashi hadn't asked a question at all. Over the following days, Takashi found himself unable to stop thinking about the bell. He would pause in his work to look at it. During meditation, his mind would drift to wondering what it would sound like. At night, lying in his simple room, he imagined the deep resonance that must live inside all that bronze, waiting to be released. He asked other monks about it. Some shrugged, having long ago accepted the bell's silence as simply the way things were. Others smiled mysteriously and said nothing. A few offered contradictory explanations. The bell was too sacred to ring except on special occasions that never came. The bell had a crack and would shatter if struck. The bell was a meditation on potential, on the unmanifested. None of these answers satisfied Takashi. He began to feel that the bell was calling to him somehow, that its very silence was a question posed to him personally. He found himself drawn to it repeatedly throughout each day, standing before it, studying the carvings, looking at the mallet resting beside it. One evening, unable to sleep, he rose and walked to the courtyard. The moon was full, casting silver light across everything. The bell glowed softly in the moonlight, its bronze surface seeming to hold inner luminescence. The monastery was silent around him. Everyone else was asleep. He approached the bell slowly. His heart was pounding, though he couldn't say exactly why. It was just a bell, just an object. Yet, standing before it in the moonlight, it seemed to hold more significance than that. It seemed to be waiting. For what? He didn't know. He ran his fingers over the carved surface. The metal was cool beneath his touch. His fingers traced the swirling clouds, the wings of the cranes, the peaks of the mountains. Each detail had been crafted with such care, such attention. Someone had spent months, maybe years, creating these images. And for what? For a bell that was never rung? His hand moved to the mallet. It was heavier than he expected when he lifted it. The wood was smooth, worn by countless hands over countless years. Or perhaps just a few hands over many years of preparation, of intention that was never completed. He stood there holding the mallet, feeling its weight. The night air was still. The silence pressed against him. All around the courtyard, the monastery buildings stood dark and quiet. Above, the moon sailed through wisps of cloud. The moment felt suspended, charged with possibility. He raised the mallet slowly. His heart beat faster. His breath came quick and shallow. He had come to this monastery seeking understanding, seeking to deepen his practice. Was this bell part of that understanding? Was he meant to ring it? Was that what it had been waiting for all these years? The mallet hovered in the air. The bell waited, silent, patient. Takashi's arm trembled slightly from holding the mallet up, from the tension of this frozen moment. What would happen if he struck it? Would the sound wake everyone? Would the elders be angry? Would some ancient prophecy be fulfilled or broken? Would the bell shatter, as some had suggested, or would it ring with a note so pure it would transform everything? His mind raced with questions, with possibilities, with fears and hopes. And then, slowly, he lowered the mallet. Not because he decided against ringing the bell, but because in that moment of hovering, in that space between decision and action, he felt something. A quality of attention that was complete without needing to do anything. A fullness in the potential that would somehow be diminished by actualization. He set the mallet down carefully, exactly where it had been. He stood for a moment longer, looking at the bell in the moonlight. Then he turned and walked back to his room, leaving the bell as he had found it. Silent. Waiting. The next morning, as he went about his morning duties, the elder monk he had first spoken to approached him. The old man was carrying a bucket of water from the well, moving with the careful balance of someone who had done this task 10,000 times. "You visited the bell last night," the elder said. It wasn't a question. Takashi felt his face grow warm. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to." The elder shook his head. "There is nothing to apologize for. Did you ring it?" "No," Takashi said. "Why not?" Takashi struggled to find words for what he had experienced. "I don't know exactly. I wanted to. I raised the mallet. But then I realized that in that moment before striking, something was complete. The bell didn't need to be rung to fulfill its purpose. It was already doing what it was meant to do." The elder monk smiled, a warm expression that reached his eyes. "And what is it doing?" "Teaching," Takashi said slowly, understanding as he spoke. "It teaches through not ringing, through the choice not made, through the action not taken." The elder nodded. "Yes, every moment we choose not to act is as significant as every moment we choose to act. But we rarely notice these choices. We move through life acting, doing, making things happen. We rarely pause to consider the power of restraint, of the unmade choice, of the bell that remains silent." He set down his bucket and looked at the bell standing in the courtyard. "Some of the novices who come here are frustrated by the bell. They think it's a test, that they're supposed to ring it to prove something. Others ignore it completely after a while, accepting its silence without questioning. But occasionally, someone understands what you understood last night. that the bell's teaching is in the space between striking and not striking, in the moment of choice itself. But won't it always be that way? Takashi asked. Won't the bell always be unrung, always just potential? Perhaps, the elder said. Or perhaps one day someone will ring it and that will be the right moment. Who can say? The point isn't whether the bell rings or doesn't ring. The point is learning to live in the uncertainty, to appreciate the power of both action and inaction, to see that what we choose not to do shapes our lives as much as what we choose to do. In the following weeks, Takashi's relationship with the bell changed. He no longer felt compelled to ring it. He would pass it in the courtyard and feel a sense of companionship, almost. The bell in its silence, him in his learning. Both existing in that space of potential, of choice not yet made, of action held in careful balance with restraint. He began to notice this pattern elsewhere in the monastery. The garden that was allowed to grow somewhat wild rather than being perfectly manicured. The words not spoken in conversations, the silences that communicated as much as speech. The meals that were simple rather than elaborate. The schedule that left open time rather than filling every moment with activity. The whole monastery, he realized, was built around this principle. Not just doing, but knowing when not to do. Not just speaking, but knowing when silence serves better. Not just acting, but recognizing that restraint is itself a powerful form of action. One evening, months later, he was sitting in meditation when he heard it. Not the bell. The bell remained silent as always. But in his mind, in his heart, he heard what the bell would sound like if struck. A deep, resonant tone that seemed to contain all sounds within it. A note that would ripple out across the mountains, echoing off the peaks, fading slowly into the vast silence. He heard this sound without the bell being struck. And he understood that this was the bell's gift. Not the actual sound, but the imagined sound. Not the fulfilled potential, but the potential itself. The bell was more powerful unrung than it could ever be rung, because unrung it contained infinite possibilities. Every person who stood before it heard a different tone in their imagination. Every person experienced a different teaching. If someone finally rang it, it would make one sound, and that sound would define it forever. People would say, "Oh yes, the bell sounds like this." But unrung, it sounds like everything and nothing. It exists in pure potential, pure possibility. This story touches something subtle in Zen Buddhism's teaching about action. We live in a world that constantly tells us to do something. Take action. Make things happen. Don't just stand there. Accomplish something. Leave your mark. But the bell teaches a different wisdom. That sometimes the most powerful choice is the choice not to act. That restraint can be more significant than action. That what we choose not to do shapes our lives as profoundly as what we do. Takashi almost rang the bell. He raised the mallet. He was ready to act. But in that suspended moment, he discovered something essential. The space between decision and action contains its own kind of completion. The potential held but not released has its own kind of power. Think about how often we act without this pause. We speak without considering whether silence might serve better. We intervene without asking whether the situation might resolve itself. We do things simply because we can, because we're able to, because action feels like accomplishment. But the bell suggests that non-action is also a choice, not merely the absence of action. When Takashi lowered the mallet, he wasn't failing to act. He was choosing not to act, which is entirely different. One is passive, the other is active restraint. This matters because so much of our suffering comes from unnecessary action. We create problems by interfering in situations that would resolve themselves. We damage relationships by speaking when silence would heal. We exhaust ourselves doing things that don't actually need doing. We ring bells that teach more through silence. The elder monk's insight was profound. Every choice not to act is as significant as every choice to act. But we rarely notice these negative choices. We count our accomplishments, our actions, our doing. We don't count the times we chose restraint, the words we didn't speak, the interventions we withheld. Yet these uncounted choices shape our lives enormously. The argument we didn't start, the email we didn't send in anger, the impulse we didn't follow, the bell we didn't ring. Each of these non-actions has consequences, creates results, affects outcomes. What makes this teaching subtle is that it's not advocating for passivity. The bell isn't silent because no one cares about it or because ringing it doesn't matter. It's silent because that silence serves a purpose. It teaches. It invites contemplation. It preserves possibility. Takashi's realization about the bell containing infinite possibilities while unrung captures something essential. Once rung, the bell becomes defined. It sounds like this particular note, this specific tone. But unrung, it sounds like every note imaginable. Every person who contemplates it hears something different in their mind, receives a different teaching. This is the power of the incomplete, the undone, the held back. It remains open, undefined, full of potential. The moment we act, we collapse that potential into one specific outcome. Sometimes that's necessary and right. But sometimes, perhaps more often than we realize, the potential itself is more valuable than any specific manifestation. For those of us seeking rest, this teaching offers particular wisdom. We often lie awake feeling we should be doing something, planning something, solving something, taking some action that will make tomorrow better or easier or more secure. The mind races with things to do, ways to act, problems to solve. But what if the teaching is that sometimes the most powerful choice is to do nothing? Not from helplessness or giving up, but from recognizing that action isn't always necessary. That some problems resolve themselves. That rest itself is valuable. That the mind held in stillness has its own kind of power. The bell standing silent in the courtyard isn't waiting to be rung. It's complete as it is. And perhaps we are too. Not needing to accomplish one more thing, solve one more problem, take one more action before we can rest. Complete in this moment. Silent like the bell. Powerful in our stillness. A man named Daichi spent his life walking toward the horizon. Every morning, he rose with the sun and set out in the direction where sky met earth. That place in the distance where everything seemed to end and begin at once. That line where the world completed itself. He had started this journey when he was young, barely more than a boy. He had stood in his village and looked out at the horizon, and something in him had whispered that there, in that distant place, he would find what he was looking for. He didn't know what that was exactly. Purpose, maybe. Understanding. the answer to questions he couldn't quite form into words. So he had left. His mother had wept. His father had tried to reason with him, but Daichi was certain. The horizon called to him. He would walk until he reached it. Years passed. His steps never slowed. Towns and rivers faded behind him. Other travelers passed him going the opposite direction, returning from wherever they had been. They would sometimes call out greetings, offer to share their food or water. Daichi would accept these kindnesses, but never lingered. He had somewhere to be. His beard grew long, untrimmed. His clothes wore out, and he replaced them with new ones from villages he passed through. He worked odd jobs for food and shelter, but never stayed longer than necessary. A few days to earn enough to continue, then back on the path. The landscape changed around him. Forests gave way to plains. Plains became hills. Hills rose into mountains. He crossed rivers, skirted lakes, walked through deserts where the horizon shimmered with heat. And always, it remained the same distance away. This should have troubled him, but somehow it didn't. He had committed to this journey. The horizon was his destination, and he would reach it eventually. Each day brought him closer. He was certain of this, even as the years accumulated and the distance never seemed to change. His shadow stretched and shrank with the turning days. In morning it pointed behind him, marking where he'd been. At noon it disappeared beneath his feet. In evening it stretched ahead, long and thin, as if trying to reach the horizon before he did. One evening, as the sun dipped low and turned the sky orange and purple and red, he looked up and felt his heart catch. The horizon was close. Closer than it had ever been. He could almost touch it. The place where sky met earth was right there, just ahead. His breath quickened. His legs, tired from decades of walking, found new strength. This was it. The end of his journey. The arrival he had worked his entire life toward. He took a final step forward, his foot coming down on earth that felt no different from any other earth he had walked across. The sky remained above him. The ground remained beneath his feet. And the horizon, that line where everything was supposed to complete, had moved. It was ahead of him still. The same distance it had always been. Daichi stood perfectly still. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he wasn't moving forward. He was just standing, breathing, looking at the horizon that remained forever out of reach. And then, slowly, he turned around. Behind him, his footsteps stretched back forever. Or they would have, if footsteps lasted. But the wind had long ago erased every trace of his passage. The ground showed no evidence that he had walked there. The towns he had passed through had probably forgotten him. The people he had met briefly were living their lives, unaware that somewhere far away, a man who had once walked through their village was standing in the middle of nowhere, realizing something. The desert was silent around him. Not empty exactly, but vast. The wind moved across the sand, creating patterns, erasing patterns, creating new ones. The sun continued its descent, painting the sky in colors that had no names. Somewhere in the distance, the horizon waited. It would always wait. It would never arrive. Because that's what horizons do. They mark the limit of vision, not the limit of the world. They exist as a function of where you stand, not as a place you can go. Daichi sat down on the sand. His legs, which had carried him so far, folded beneath him. He removed the pack from his back and set it aside. Inside were his few possessions: a water skin, a small pot for cooking, a blanket, the tools of endless travel. Things to keep him moving toward a destination that didn't exist as a destination. He sat there as the sun set completely and stars began to appear. The night was cool, the air clean and clear. The stars were brilliant, more brilliant than he remembered them being in his youth. Or perhaps he had simply forgotten to look up while he was so focused on the horizon ahead. A desert fox appeared at the edge of his vision. It paused, regarding him with intelligent eyes, then continued on its way. It wasn't walking toward the horizon. It was walking toward wherever foxes go. Toward food or water or shelter. Toward real things in real places. As dawn approached, Daichi still Saturday. His mind was quiet in a way it hadn't been for decades. All those years of walking, of purposeful movement toward a goal, had kept his mind occupied. Now, with the goal revealed as impossible, as never having existed in the way he thought, his mind had nothing to do but be still. The sun rose behind him. He felt its warmth on his back. The horizon in front of him glowed with new light. And it was still there, still the same distance away, still promising completion if only he could reach it. But he didn't stand up. He didn't continue walking. Instead, he turned his body to face the rising Sunday. He watched it clear the horizon behind him, the one he had never paid attention to because he was so focused on the one ahead. And he began, slowly, to understand something. That the journey itself was what he had been looking for. Not the destination. The walking, the movement through changing landscapes, the meeting with strangers, the nights under unfamiliar stars. This had been the gift. Not what awaited at the end, but what happened along the way. He had spent his entire life walking towards something that couldn't be reached, and in doing so, he had walked through his entire life. And now, sitting still for the first time in decades, he wondered what he had missed while he was so focused on where he was going. The question wasn't whether the horizon moved. It did. It always would. The question was whether he needed to keep chasing it, whether he could find meaning in standing still, whether completion could exist without arrival. This story touches something essential in Zen Buddhism about seeking and finding. Daichi represents all of us in our various pursuits. We set goals, we chase achievements, we work toward destinations. We think that when we get there, wherever there is, we'll finally be complete, finally satisfied, finally able to rest. But what Daichi discovered is what Zen sees clearly. The horizon isn't a place. It's a perspective. It exists relative to where we stand. No matter how far we travel, it moves with us. We can walk our entire lives toward it and never arrive. This isn't a failure, it's the nature of horizons. They mark the limit of our vision, not the limit of possibility. They show us how far we can see from where we are, not where the world ends. We do this with everything. We chase happiness as if it's a destination we'll reach. We pursue enlightenment as if it's a state we'll finally attain and maintain forever. We work towards security, success, achievement, thinking that when we get there, the seeking can stop. We can rest. But the horizon keeps moving. We reach one goal and immediately see another. We achieve one level of success and start thinking about the next. We find one answer and it reveals 10 new questions. There's always more horizon ahead. Daichi spent his entire life walking. Think about that. Decades of purposeful movement. His whole adult life devoted to a single pursuit. This takes dedication, commitment, focus. These aren't bad qualities, but they were directed towards something that couldn't be reached in the way he imagined. What's heartbreaking about the story is realizing everything he missed while walking. The towns were just places to pass through. The people were just brief encounters. The landscapes were just things to cross. He was always on his way to somewhere else, so he was never really present to where he was. This is what Zen calls the trap of seeking. We become so focused on getting somewhere that we miss being anywhere. We're so concentrated on the future completion that we're not present for the current moment. We walk through our entire lives on the way to somewhere else. When Daichi finally stopped, when he sat down in the desert and let go of his impossible goal, something shifted. The quietness that came wasn't the quietness of giving up. It was the quietness of finally arriving, not at the horizon, but at now. At here. At the present moment that he had been walking past for decades. The desert fox offered a subtle teaching. It wasn't walking toward the horizon. It was walking towards something real. Food, water, shelter. Things that actually exist in actual places. Its life had purpose without needing an impossible destination. It moved through the world, responding to what was actually there, not to some symbolic line that could never be crossed. The question the story poses is direct. What are we chasing that's like the horizon? What impossible standard are we walking toward, thinking that when we get there, everything will finally be right? What completion are we seeking that exists only as a function of where we're standing, that will move every time we move? And, more importantly, what are we missing while we chase? What actual life is happening right now that we're walking past because we're so focused on getting somewhere else? What beauty, what connection, what meaning is available right here that we don't notice because here isn't where we're trying to be? Zen Buddhism doesn't promise that we'll reach the horizon if we practice correctly. It promises something better. That we'll realize the horizon was never the point. That completion isn't a place we arrive, but a way of being. That we can stop walking away from where we are and start actually being here. The sunrise Daichi witnessed when he turned around was always there. He had just never turned to face it. He was so busy walking toward one horizon that he never noticed the other one behind him. This is what we all do. Focus so intently on one direction that we miss everything else. A night watchman named Sato walked the quiet streets of the village, lighting lanterns as darkness fell. This was his duty, performed each evening for more years than he could count. He knew every doorway, every corner, every shadow. The village felt like an extension of his own body, so familiar was its geography. He carried flint and a small torch, moving from lantern to lantern with practiced efficiency. At each door, he would pause, strike his flint, coax flame from spark. The small fire would catch on his torch, and he would transfer it to the lantern's wick. One by one, the lanterns flickered to life, creating pools of golden light against the gathering dark. The work was meditative in its repetition. Strike, light, move on. Strike, light, move on. Each lantern the same, yet slightly different. The same process creating the same result, night after night, season after season. As he bent to light a lantern outside a merchant's house, he noticed a man sitting on the steps. This was unusual. Most people were inside by this hour, preparing their evening meals or settling in for the night. The man sat perfectly still, watching Sato work. "Careful," Sato said, more out of habit than real concern. "The streets are dangerous in the dark." The man looked at him with a slight smile. "Are they?" Something about the question made Sato pause. Of course, the streets were dangerous in the dark. That was why he lit the lanterns. That was his entire purpose. To make the village safe at night by pushing back the darkness with light. Before he could respond, a breeze stirred through the street. Not a strong wind, just a gentle movement of air. But it was enough. The lanterns he had already lit began to flutter. Their flames danced, casting moving shadows across the walls. And in that moment, in the shifting light and shadow, Sato saw something he had never noticed before. The street was glowing. Pale silver light illuminated everything. The houses, the stones, the trees. It wasn't lantern light. It was moonlight, falling softly from above, painting the world in gentle silver. He had been so focused on lighting his lanterns that he had never really looked at the night itself, had never noticed that darkness wasn't actually dark, that the moon provided its own light, different from but no less real than the lantern's glow. Then, in a single breath, the wind swept through the village with more force. It moved from house to house, street to street, and extinguished every lantern Sato had lit. One after another, the flames went out. The golden pools of light disappeared. Sato stood perfectly still, his flint in one hand, his torch in the other. Darkness pooled around him. Or what he had always thought of as darkness. But as his eyes adjusted, as he stopped trying to see by lantern light and started seeing what was actually there, he realized the village wasn't dark at all. The moon was nearly full, hanging high in the clear sky. Its light showed the outlines of rooftops, the shapes of trees, the pathway through the streets. Everything was visible, just in a different way. The quality of silver moonlight was softer than lantern glow, subtler. It didn't create the sharp boundaries between light and shadow that fire did. Instead, it washed over everything with gentle evenness. Nothing was hidden in complete darkness, but nothing was harshly illuminated either. He turned back toward the house where the man had been sitting. But the steps were empty. The man was gone. Or had he been there at all? Sato couldn't be certain now. The moonlight played tricks, suggested presences that might be real or might be shadows. The night stretched on. The wind carried nothing but silence. The village slept, its people safe in their homes, unaware that the lanterns had gone out. Unaware that the watchman stood in the street, holding unlit flint, learning something about the nature of light and darkness. Sato walked slowly through the village, not lighting lanterns now, just walking. Seeing his familiar streets transformed by moonlight. The merchant's shop looked different. The temple looked different. His own shadow moved beside him, less sharp than his shadow in lantern light, but still there, still visible. He passed the well at the center of the village. In lantern light, it was just a well. A practical thing, a source of water. But in moonlight, it became something else. The stone rim glowed silver. The darkness within it held mystery, The rope that hung down into it seemed to descend into another world. A cat crossed the street ahead of him. In lantern light, he would have seen it clearly. Brown and white, the markings distinct. In moonlight, it was all silver and shadow, a suggestion of Katniss moving with perfect confidence through the transformed landscape. Sato reached the edge of the village where his small house stood. He stopped at his door, but didn't go inside immediately. He stood looking back at the village he had walked through for so many years, seeing it new. The lanterns still hung outside each door, dark now, empty. The moon still hung above, full and bright. And he realized he had a choice. He could relight the lanterns. That was his duty after all. The villagers expected their streets lit at night. They depended on him to push back the darkness, to make their world safe and visible. They paid him for this service. But he had seen what he had seen. The village didn't need his lanterns. Not really. The moon provided light enough. Different light, softer light, but light nonetheless. And perhaps there was value in this softer illumination. Perhaps there were things that could be seen in moonlight that harsh lantern light would obscure. He stood at his doorway, flint in hand, decision hovering before him. Relight the lanterns and return everything to how it had always been. Or leave them dark and see what the village looked like when lit only by what was already there. The night was cool. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. The stars were visible, brilliant pinpoints in the vast darkness that wasn't really dark. Sato lowered his flint. He didn't put it away, just lowered it to his side. He would carry it with him still as he walked. But tonight, maybe just tonight, he would walk by moonlight. He would let the village see itself differently. He would let the people wake to find their lanterns unlit and wonder what that meant. Perhaps they would be frightened. Perhaps they would demand he light them immediately. Perhaps he would lose his position as watchman for this failure to fulfill his duty. Or perhaps they would step outside and see what he had seen. The silvery world, the soft shadows, the way moonlight transformed everything familiar into something new. Perhaps they would understand that they had been living under one kind of light, never knowing there were other ways of seeing. He walked on through the village, his flint quiet, his torch extinguished. The moon moved slowly across the sky, marking time in its ancient way. The lanterns hung empty. And Sato, for the first time in all his years of service, was watchman to a different kind of light. Not the light he created, but the light that was already there, had always been there, waiting to be noticed. This story reveals another layer of Zen teaching about perception and reality. Sato believed he was bringing light to darkness. He believed his work was essential, that without his lanterns the village would be lost in dangerous shadow. And, in a sense, he was right. The lanterns did provide light. But what he hadn't understood was that his lanterns were one kind of light, not the only kind. When they went out, he discovered that darkness contained its own illumination. Different, softer, but present. He had been so focused on the light he created that he'd never noticed the light that existed independently of his efforts. This is what Zen means when it talks about seeing truly. We think we see reality, but actually we see reality as lit by our own assumptions, our own expectations, our own habits. We create the light we see by, then mistake that created light for the only light available. Sato's lanterns weren't wrong. Lantern light serves a purpose. It's bright, clear, practical. but it's also selective. It creates sharp boundaries between light and shadow. It shows some things very clearly while leaving others in complete darkness. It's one way of illuminating the world, not the way. Moonlight offers a different truth. It's gentler, more even. It doesn't create harsh boundaries. It shows everything in softer tones, with less certainty but perhaps more mystery. Things that would be hidden in shadow by lantern light become visible in moonlight's gentler illumination. What makes this teaching subtle is that Sato's entire identity was built around lighting lanterns. This was his purpose, his duty, his contribution. To discover that the lanterns weren't strictly necessary threatened who he understood himself to be. If the moon provides adequate light, what's a night watchman for? But notice, the story doesn't suggest he abandoned his lanterns permanently. He lowers his flint, but he doesn't throw it away. He's making space to see differently, not eliminating all other options. This is the flexibility Zen encourages. Not rigid attachment to one way of seeing, but willingness to experiment with different perspectives. The stranger on the steps who disappeared plays the role that teachers often play in Zen stories. Appearing just long enough to ask the right question, then vanishing. Are the streets dangerous in the dark? This simple question invited Sato to examine his assumption. He had always believed they were. But were they? Or had he just never looked? When the lanterns went out and he was forced to see by moonlight, he discovered the streets weren't what he thought. They were visible, navigable, even beautiful. The darkness he had spent years fighting against turned out not to be darkness at all. Just different light requiring different eyes. We all do this. We illuminate our lives in one particular way and think that's how things are. We see our problems by the harsh light of anxiety and miss the softer truths that gentler attention would reveal. We understand our relationships by the sharp light of judgment and miss the mystery that moonlight acceptance would show us. What would it mean to occasionally let your lanterns go out? To stop creating the light you think you need and see what light is already there? To trust that darkness might contain its own forms of illumination? This is especially relevant as we prepare for rest. We often approach sleep while carrying our own harsh lights. The bright illumination of worry, of planning, of trying to solve everything. We flood our minds with this intense light, thinking we need to see everything clearly before we can rest. But maybe sleep comes easier by moonlight, by the gentler illumination that doesn't try to make everything sharp and clear, by the softer light that allows mystery, that permits not knowing, that trusts in what's naturally there rather than what we force into being. Sato walked through his village for years, lighting lanterns, never questioning. Then one night the wind came and showed him differently. That's all Zen asks. Not that we abandon what we know, but that we remain open to seeing differently when the wind blows our certainties out. As our journey through these Zen teachings comes to its natural close, you've traveled far from where you began. Not in distance, but in understanding. You've encountered monks who carried burdens they didn't need to carry. Travelers who discovered that what they sought was closer than they imagined. Artists who learned that transformation isn't the same as loss. All of them finding wisdom not through complex philosophy, but through simple presence. Each story carried a seed of truth about living with more ease, with less struggle. The truth isn't hidden in some distant monastery or secret text. It's right here in how we meet this moment, in whether we grip tightly or hold gently, in whether we fight against what is or learn to move with it. Zen Buddhism doesn't promise to make your life perfect or problem-free. It offers something more valuable, a way of being with life exactly as it is, with its changes and uncertainties, with its joys and sorrows, with its constant movement that never quite arrives anywhere permanent. The peace these teachings point toward isn't fragile. It doesn't depend on everything going right or staying the same. It's the peace that comes from recognizing you're already part of something larger than your individual concerns, already held by forces you don't have to manage, already complete even in your incompleteness. Tonight, as you finally release into rest, you can trust these ancient understandings, that the trying itself is often what prevents arrival, that the control you grip so tightly is less necessary than you believe. That rest comes not through solving everything, but through temporarily letting everything be exactly as it is. Your breathing is slowing naturally now. Your body knows how to rest without your conscious management. The thoughts that circle and return will eventually tire of their movement and settle, all on their own, without you having to make this happen. The monks and travelers in these stories discovered something essential. That peace isn't achieved through effort. It's revealed when effort stops interfering, like the soup that stirred itself, like the bridge that held by bending, like the bell that taught through silence. You don't need to carry tomorrow's concerns into tonight's rest. The merchant learned this by the roadside. The burden can be set down. It will still be there if you need to pick it up again. But for now, for these hours of darkness, you can travel light. The horizon will always be ahead, no matter how far you walk. The man in the desert learned this. So perhaps the invitation is to stop walking towards some future moment when everything will finally be right. To discover that rightness is available now in the simple fact of being alive and aware. Let your body settle completely into the support beneath you. Feel how you don't have to hold yourself up. Something is already holding you. Let your mind release its grip on the day's events and tomorrow's plans. They can wait. You can't solve everything tonight anyway. The lanterns have gone out. The moonlight is enough. You can see by different light now. The gentler illumination of trust, of letting go, of allowing rest to arrive in its own way. Zen teaches that enlightenment is not a distant goal but your natural condition, temporarily hidden by busy efforts to find it. In sleep, all seeking ceases, all effort stops. And what remains is the fundamental peace that was here all along, beneath the noise, beneath the trying, beneath the endless reaching for what you already are. May your rest tonight be deep and restorative. May you wake with the clarity that comes from having truly let go. May you carry some small seed of these teachings into your days, remembering that peace is not something you achieve. It's something you recognize was always here. The stream keeps flowing. The bell remains silent. The moon keeps rising. And you, part of all this, can finally rest. Tonight, as you finally release into sleep, you can trust that you are returning to your most natural state. Sleep is not an escape from awareness, but awareness freed from the burden of constantly trying to manage experience. In deep rest, the boundaries between self and world naturally soften, revealing the interconnected nature of all existence. Let your breathing slow and deepen completely. Feel your body releasing all tension, returning to its natural state of ease. Allow your mind to release its grip on problems, plans, and concerns, trusting that clarity will return naturally with the dawn. The Zen tradition reminds us that enlightenment is not a distant goal, but our natural condition, temporarily veiled by our busy efforts to find it. In sleep, all seeking ceases, all effort stops, and what remains is the fundamental peace that has been here all along. Sleep well, and thank you for joining us here at Sleepy Monk.